Hey there. I want to speak directly to those of you who are on the younger end of our listenership, and those of you who are maybe not as long in years as some of the rest of us. This is an episode where we speak to you. We hear you, and we appreciate you, and we also recognize you have some unique challenges in your lives at this particular moment in our culture. So we speak to that a little bit. But for those of you who are a little bit older and want to have some thoughtful analysis of maybe ways in which you can be helpful to the younger people in your life, I hope you'll listen through this as well, and that something productive will manifest as we think about what it means to be a big church that helps us wrestle with all aspects and elements of our lives.
Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
So back to the topic of cultural engagement. We come to this one from time to time, but I saw an article that sparked my interest. We'll link it in the show notes. This came from Mere Orthodoxy, and this is from a younger writer, and this guy is a card-carrying member of Gen Z. And so here's what's intriguing about it. He's offering a little bit of a different take on how the evangelical movement can stay afloat right now. Now, so I get a little wary of the word evangelicalism still, Nathan. I don't think that would include you. So I suppose a better way of saying this would be
I feel like I just got kicked out of
people
something.
who are theologically
but we have to use the terms roughly. Even Gen Z is, you and I kind of roll our eyes sometimes at the millennial Gen Z distinctions, but we have to have these broad terms in order to have a conversation about it.
Sure.
So
we do. Yeah. So, think theologically conservative Christians in North America trying to A, make sense of this moment, and B, figure out what we do about it. And so he talked about a number of different factors that are going on right now, particularly with younger people his age. So he talked about a growing sense of just real pessimism about the future, fear and isolation, and the statistics bear this out. Nathan, I think you were talking to me the other day about a conversation you had where somebody said, let me tell you, if you're an academic doing any kind of studies, if you want to get a grant, loneliness is the place you want to go.
Studies.
That's pretty much a guarantee. Loneliness studies. So we can kind of smile a little bit at that for a second, but it's also deeply sad to see how prevalent that is. But yeah, so loneliness, but also a growing, just a sense that the future is dark. I think we've talked before on the show, Nathan, about how that itself is a bit unique, looking at the future and just seeing it as foreboding rather than promising. But also,
hang on, just real quick, a caveat on that. It seems to me so there have always been groups of people who have been like that. When I was the age of what's now considered Gen Z, I would have thought that it's an older generation that's worried about the future and the unknowns. And, these are perilous times, kind of, you think of your great grandpa's, worries about the future of the world and what kind of world are these kids going to grow up in. And that the youth had this perhaps naive idealism of, hey, we're going to, grab the bull by the horns and make things work. The new feature is that it's the youngest generation now that's the most pessimistic and worried. I think that so yes,
right.
It's not new that there are people who are worried about the future. It is new which generation, which category of people is. I don't know what that means, but just let's be aware of that as we go by.
And some of the, younger people, think about being in your formative years when in 2020, for instance. That is quite an experience to go through. And
hang on. Okay,
to see the world. Yes.
Yeah, except for all the people who lived through World War II and World War I and were formed during the Cold War and were formed during the Holocaust and were formed. What's the difference there?
I don't actually. I don't know if I'm with you on that one, Nathan. I think I would say that yes, but there obviously have there been horrendous epochs in the modern world. Well, yes, and moments in history. So I'm not comparing that. I'm just saying if you in your formative years see kind of what looks like at least civilization coming undone in some important ways, or just brought to its knees. And I mean, you have no reference point. I mean, this is, if you're a young person, you're not, you don't have, suffering is always unique. I think that's something I have to bear in mind, because on the one hand, it is important to get perspective. And this is where all of us could benefit from knowing history and looking at what other people have gone through down the ages. But on the other hand, what you experience in your own time, these are going to be unique circumstances and they will affect you in unique ways. And I think 2020 was a moment of just very, regardless of where people fell on what they thought was happening, it was a moment of real fear and total uncertainty. And it was global. And also, one of the unique features now, Nathan, we talk about this a lot, is even something like the Second World War, for instance, you wouldn't be as in the know about everything that was going on all the time. But you are now, because of the nature of modern news. And so there's this constant stream, the doom scrolling, as we used to call it, that this big influx and that constant awareness. I think, I mean, all I'm saying is I think that was a uniquely frightening experience, especially if you're a younger person, and all of I mean, most people, the jokes were all that the world is coming to an end. This looks apocalyptic. That became almost sort of an in-house joke. But just think, if that's the backdrop of your childhood, I don't know.
Yeah,
That's a
well, okay,
pretty
but what's the difference?
dramatic.
What's the difference though, where you have so this is a little hard. Like, all right, let's make sure we're on this, or we either are or aren't on the same page here. What's the difference of growing up in a country where um you had food and tire rations and you're on the cusp of being drafted into a time in which like nuclear bombs are actually being dropped on other countries? It's hard to say like, well, a 17-year-old now is really wrestling with a whole lot more than somebody who, yet when we look at that
Oh, I didn't say a whole
generation,
lot more. I said different.
right? So
It's
so
different. It's not the
is the
same thing.
difference
I don't know if that's a fair comparison.
is the difference though? So this is what I'm trying to work out, what the difference is that, are we at a time in which the anxiety that accompanies being a young adult during the pandemic is based on the idea of a helplessness, where in previous crises of the past, there is a sense of like, I have the skills and tools to contribute to the solution to the problem. What So yes, every crisis is unique to the
Yeah.
person experiencing it, but we do have some pretty massive shifts in the paralysis that follows from our response to that.
Well, and I don't know if this is often not something that is at the level of articulation. It's more, I think, something that's sensed and felt. But the social fabric now is so frayed. And that's different. You
Mhm.
look, when you see these crises that are happening now, there's a lack of unity, there's a lack of cohesion. So the pandemic, for instance, obviously was fodder for massive division and huge conflict, actually, not just tensions, but active conflict. And so, and you see world leaders, everybody's squabbling about this. So what the takeaway from this, I think, is a picture of profound instability. And so
Okay.
back to the article real briefly. Yes.
Well, I was going to say, I
I
think
think
I can agree.
that is
Let me agree with you here, and I think this will segue back. Is to say that one of the things that I noticed just
mhm,
over the last 5 years in observation is that people are able to bear up under unbelievable chaos and pain and difficulty if they have stable social relationships. And so
right.
perhaps that is the fundamental difference, is that we had the familial and institutional connections in previous generations that gave us a context, a history, a multi generational memory, a network of people to discuss things with that were actually physically present and proximate to us, and so that there was a social
Shared
stability
narrative.
and communal identity and shared narrative that was radically stabilizing in the face of great uncertainty. That even in a time when we have a what would be comparatively a less disruptive time, we no longer have the support structures in place to help us make sense of it. So in that sense, I think we can find some common ground there to loop back around to what this young man was writing.
Yeah, so he's talking about that, and he'll use some of the words, some of the language from sociologists in recent years, deinstitutionalization. We're increasingly, basically, what that's code for is everybody decides for themselves what they want to do and how they want to live. And that, again, on the face of it, that might sound really promising and even fun. Yes, freedom. I get to be and do whatever I want. The Disney dream has come to full fruition. But actually, it's turning out that it's a recipe for chronic loneliness, fear, and anxiety, because that's what we're seeing. So increasingly, many people have no idea what to do and really how to live well. And so the way he puts it is the script is gone. We don't have scripts anymore. And yeah, so say farewell to the shared narratives, say farewell to the thick bonds of community, say farewell to those scripts that are handed to you. So, how do Christians address a world, a culture that has lost its script? And I think that's, first of all, that's a really good question. I think that's a good way to put it. And regardless of how you think about this moment in history, the truth is, I mean, when you look at, you can clearly, I think we could make some non-controversial claims here, Nathan, by saying that our culture is in disarray right now. The social fabric is pretty challenged. We've got some serious issues on our hands, and that's putting it lightly. There's nothing wrong with saying that. So, what do we do to respond to that? So this young writer suggests that, and he pulls out, you know, Richard Niebuhr's Christ and Culture book, and looks at, so that's a book worth checking out at some point if you do. It gives several different types of cultural engagement models: Christ against culture, Christ above culture, Christ and culture and paradox,
For culture.
and goes through Christ for culture, and goes through you know the the pros and cons of each of those. So one of the items that he does open up with, and this does concern evangelicalism, and this is worth bringing up really quickly, is Carl Carl F. H. Henry's, and I don't remember the name of this tract, but he basically wrote a manifesto for evangelicalism. Evangelicalism, as we know it in the United States, was born out of, it was kind of a middle way. It was a middle way between fundamentalism on the one hand and then mainline Christianity on the other. Fundamentalism was sectarian and wanted to, and get away from the culture, separate ourselves. And mainline was very, progressive, for culture. And so this was meant to be a middle way that held on to Christian orthodoxy and virtues and ethics, but at the same time also engaged culture. So what do we do now? How do we engage a culture that has no script? So this young guy suggests repairing, a picture of repairing or a picture of healing. Christians ought to be right now in this moment agents of healing in our culture, helping to fix broken institutions, helping to fix broken marriages, helping to fix people who are in the wreckage of relationships, but healing people who are about bringing restoration and healing. And I think there's something there, Nathan. That's what I wanted to. So Christianity as the cultural engagement of today, as repairing, as healing.
Yeah. So, okay, let me say why that feels improbable. Let's make it worse before we make it better. Um, because I do overall like the that angle. Um, it seems to me though that the challenge is that we don't have a culture anymore. And so, like
Hmm.
does the phrase American culture make sense as or is it American cultures, or have we, so when you've lost, I think you used the phrase, we lost the plot. When you no longer have a way of life in common together, that makes it challenging to say, so does the church engage the culture, or does I mean, and the church is part of culture, but or do we engage the cultures that we're embedded in? How so I think that to me feels like more, and this is me personally speaking, more of the frustration is it seems like not only have we lost the plot, but we've lost the ability to communicate and have a shared language and shared ideals, where really the ability to sit down and say, hey, here's what I'm thinking, what are you thinking, and come to a conclusion that really finds the things that multiple parties are for is getting harder and harder to do. So that would be my little dash of pessimism before we turn the corner here and think about what the church can do to address that.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, on the one hand, we have cultures, and we've got that's probably a big source. That would be a big source of our division. But on the other hand, I think you can find there is a common denominator, and that probably has to do with hyper individualism. It seems
Hmm.
to me that that is at the root of so many of our divisions, but and indeed at the root of so much of our deinstitutionalization as well. So I think if we look at it like that, yes, we're going to have specific contexts and obviously our neighborhoods in which this happens. And part of some of the examples that the article uses, by the way, are having your home open, for instance, to young people. And he uses this example, which I thought was really intriguing, teaching young people how to go on dates. So that's a new one on me, Nathan.
Yeah.
That yeah, that one. But again, if you just a moment's if we pause for a moment, that actually it makes a whole lot of sense. How many, I mean, more and more people these days, when you do hear their story, they've met online,
Yeah,
or
that's
you
true.
know, a dating app has been used, something like that. So yeah, it begins to make more sense. But that's, I think, we sometimes, if you are a person who finds yourself either you're a little bit older, or you're in a thick community, I think sometimes it's easy to lose sight of just how much we are taking for granted there. But I mean, Nathan, we were talking earlier about there are cases now more and more where younger people don't know, for instance, how to hold an infant, much less change a diaper, and that these are not
Mhm.
isolated incidents. These are new phenomena, and that's part of what it means to say on a practical level that the script is going away. You see, that's one very powerful script, a family
Yeah,
unit,
well, yes, okay,
which was pretty standard. You could take it for granted, no
yeah, well,
more.
I know somebody who's might listen to this podcast who is telling me about teaching new hires at his organization how to write a check. So these are people in their,
Right,
mid-20s, very successful academically, who had never written a check. And then you start thinking about it, when would they ever have done that? Um, and then
right,
you say, like, how
exactly.
how is it that people have a baby but have never held a baby before? That's not hard to visualize in a lot of context. So all of that to say is that I think if you're thinking of this as a from a church perspective, that the opportunities for mentorship and discipleship are not in this is where it's going to run evangelical is going to run into challenges if we think of discipleship as purely spiritual formation, because actually what's needed
Right.
is is a much deeper, broader, expansive view of how to live well, that has a plot, that has, a religious foundation to it, but also has a lot of other practical outworkings that have come naturally to, or seemingly naturally to, humans in the past that were in totally new water here. So it's not that it can't be done, but we can't separate our spiritual and physical out in neat categories and have it make sense moving forward.
Oh yeah, I mean, you're gonna have to take care of people. I mean, that's the bottom line. We're actually going to have to open our homes, cook meals, and in some cases, help teach people how to cook meals and do that. There's nothing trivial about any of that. This is this is healing work. It really is. And so, but think about this. Here's another little thought experiment. I was bringing this up earlier on the phone, and Nathan said, "Up, stop. Are we doing a podcast?" But what it strikes me though that you have in many cases, so this is where people will stand back and in a little bit of perplexity and say, okay, this is really odd though, because I mean, granted, the economic situation right now isn't great, but broadly speaking, we're very affluent, we're really connected, we're really comfortable. What's wrong? What is so drastically wrong? And then you can also look at it in these terms. Well, we've got way more free time than we've ever had. There's discussion now about moving to 4-hour work weeks, of course, versus 8-hour work weeks, all of that.
Mhm.
But even with that, we have more time than ever. Many people have more disposable income, more technological convenience, and yet there's so much misery. So what's going on? It almost seems as though we were not made to live only for our own gratification. I mean, that's one
Hmm.
that's one conclusion that's
Oh, that's
really
one way
hard
to
to
look at it.
avoid here.
Yeah,
It almost
it almost seems.
yeah, I mean, it almost seems as though, yeah, part of human purpose and telos really does have to be intrinsic and real, and that we were actually made for, well, of course, we as Christians believe we're made for God and then for others, but we really are made for others in relationships
Mhm.
of, so in that sense, the more tied up you are, the better off you are. So yeah, our lives are crazy, Nathan. I mean, you have 4 little people in your house, and I have 2 in my house, and we're always running around to soccer matches. We're having to run to the school to grab them if they're sick, all of that. And so it is profoundly inconvenient, and it completely gets in the way of a lot of what I'm doing. And most of what my children want to talk to me about has nothing to do with what's in my head or what I want to talk about. And it's also good for me. It's great. And you know, part of it, it sounds so countercultural, and this is almost, to say that, but you were made to exist for other people, and you're made to live for a purpose that exceeds your own wishes and fancies. Again, and not that it's
Mhm.
not, I love that people have hobbies and things that they love to do. That's fantastic, but your life has to be more than that. I think that's what I mean, I think that's what we're
Well,
finding
all right.
the hard evidence
Yes.
for here.
So let's take a positive turn here, though. Is that I think the church has the resources to do this well if we have the vision to do it well. But what it's going to fundamentally require is more people being religious, not just spiritual. I mean, we've lived in the
Mm,
last decade of this
mhm,
idea, I'm spiritual but not religious.
sure.
And now, oh church, you're going to have to step up and say, I'm religious, and own it as a category of a reality of saying what I believe is fundamentally true about the world influences and touches every aspect of my life, including fill in the blank of all the things that people are curious about in the world. So I think there are ways to do this.
Mhm,
There's a young guy. He's a freshman in college from our church. He was over the other night. We were chatting about something, and we were getting the kids ready for bed. Everybody's running around. Some kid has their pajamas on their head. It's just the general chaos of getting ready and settle them down and have our
yep.
uh, evening worship and get them tucked in. And he was taking it all in. And I said to him, I said, "So this could be your life in 15 years." And he said, and that would be pretty great. So I think there's a sense
Hmm,
in which we have to model and demonstrate. It's what we don't want to sound like is like, oh, what's wrong with young people these days? They have no ambition, they have no vision, they have no capability. That's not true.
no.
These are the people that I know that are in the age group that you're speaking of are highly motivated, highly capable, very bright people who have a lot of energy that sometimes just haven't figured out how to get the engine in gear. So it's high RPMs, but it isn't connecting and engaging with the world in a way in which it's transferring that energy and creativity and skill into things that produce meaningful work um, in the world around them. So I think that's part of the role that the church can play is a little bit of that transmission of transferring the energy to the wheels, so to speak, of helping and casting a vision for the possible goodness of life that's out there, and the idea that you would adopt more responsibility and find more freedom in doing so, that you would take on more roles in the world and find more meaning as a result of doing that. We need to be honest about the difficult things in life, but we also need to be really honest about if you're a slightly older listener to this and you're involved in the lives of young people, you need to be go out of your way to be really honest about like the beauty, like the fun that it is to be married, and the fun that it is to have kids, and the fun that it is, the joy that comes from serving the church, and all these other things that people look at as burdensome and restrictive. Okay, there's enough negative press out there on that. If you're enjoying good things, make sure that you're sharing that with other people and letting them know, hey, if you want to be a rebel in your day, step into some of these things. And there's a lot of fullness in it. So I'm,
And also,
I,
think
yeah, I'm
about the
optimistic because I can
nature
see the
of,
pieces and how they could fit together, even though they aren't just
yeah.
right yet.
So this is also intrinsic meaning when you're living with others for others. And so I want to phrase this carefully. I'm not saying that this is something that only families have, something only married people have. Not at all. What I am saying though is when you live a life devoted to other people. Well, supremely when you live a life devoted to God and neighbor, now your existence is devoted to other human lives, those other human lives who depend on you as well. So I think part of what I'm trying to say is that this is something that takes you way beyond mere personal preference. There comes a time when personal preference is simply not enough anymore. There comes a time where you don't want to exist solely as a consumer or thinking solely as a
Hmm.
consumer, because eventually it's such a thin and hollow way to live. Not that there aren't perks there, of course, but ultimately you don't have sufficient meaning there. You don't have what I'm calling thick or intrinsic meaning, which is something that it's a basic need of human beings.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So,
We must have meaning. Yeah.
all right. So here's the question, Cameron. Can you have that without religion?
Yeah. I mean, and plenty of people are agreed, many of them not religious, that religion is necessary for a functioning society. Now, I'm not too happy when I hear that because I mean, on the one hand, they're just making an observation that of social conditions and the needed,
Mhm.
basically what you need to unite a culture, but it's a purely functionalist argument. So
Well, and you get that
obviously
through like
that
the evolutionary case for the development of religion, kind of fits
correct.
into and supports in that whole
Right.
like that's why religion exists is
Hmm.
because we need it in order to stabilize cohesive units that can get along in order to yeah.
Yeah, and so that's a purely functional view of society of religion. So yeah, but there's a powerful clue in there though. If that's how we flourish, or if we need that, if that's necessary to human flourishing, what does that say about who we are as people? So,
Yeah. So and so there are two things here. One is like, okay, here's a need that we see. It either naturalistically developed, and that's why we feel there's a need, or there's a thirst and a hunger that we have as humans there because there actually is an object that satisfies that desire. So on one hand, we're almost taking like an argument from desire and moving it from the personal level into the communal level of saying, if it is true that there is, you know, so you can look at the modern moral psychologist think I'm thinking here of Jonathan Haidt and the happiness hypothesis that says in order to have a satisfied human life, you have to have an interaction and a relationship with something bigger than yourself, good relationships with other people, and meaningful work. You have to have all three of those. So even from a non-religious perspective, that's kind of like the tripod of stability of human personality, identity, and community. And as a Christian, we would look at that and say, wow, like you got all the way to Genesis chapter 2. Like created in the image of God, it's not good for man to be
mhm.
alone, and you're put in the garden to work it. So the work, the relationship with the other people, and the interaction with something bigger than yourself, that's obvious. But then scripture goes on for another 1100 plus chapters in working out what that means. So the problem is obvious, but then the how you do that is where the church actually steps in, I think, and has something meaningful to say of, look, there's a longing and a desire. We're built and created in this way to have these longings and these needs. This is what we've been practicing for about 2000 years now. So if you'd like some, expertise on this, we'd like to step in and help you think about that. So that seems like it also seems like it's working to me. I would say anecdotally from you, me, your dad, other places, there are a lot of churches that are doing pretty well right now, and a lot of new people, a lot of new faces. It's not just people church swapping. There are a lot of people who are kind of hungry for a connection to something bigger than themselves in a way in which they can feel like they're meaningfully getting involved in the world. So it kind of seems like if you're a church, just hang in there and be faithful to what God's asking you to do. And it sounds terrible to put it kind of in these crude terms, but there's a huge market, if you want to use economic phrases, for what it is that the church specializes in. If we can keep from getting distracted on a number of other issues that are always prone to
Hmm.
derailing the church. But by and large, what it is that we have is what the world is seeking. So we just need to connect the dots.
Hang in there and think maybe more in terms of, yes, let more in terms of actually welcoming people into your homes, helping them, showing them, life, and living life together with people. I think that's, that practical hands-on. It might just sound like I'm just making sort of saying trivial statements, but in the past, so much of our ministry efforts here in North America were largely concerned with making materials, working on conferences, writing books, and doing seminars and creating
Okay.
resources for people.
You want proof of your statement, Cameron? How many times in the New
Yeah, let's
Testament
hear it.
does it say to write a book or build an evangelism curriculum versus how many times does it say practice
Hmm.
hospitality? So
Right.
what's
Yeah.
what's hilarious about this is that the church in some ways never says anything new. Like there's a bit of a sense here where it's almost hilarious. Like you get to there was a little cartoon I saw years ago of some um I think this might have been with like back like kind of when the Big Bang Theory was being popularized. So it was like imagine a little vision of a bunch of scientists climbing up a mountain, and as they're coming over the top of the mountain, there are a group of theologians sitting there saying, "Welcome, we've been here for 2,000 years." So we get into some of these
Hmm.
things where it seems like in our best moral psychology and our sociology that we're we're working so hard to climb a mountaintop, and that when we get to the top, we find like, oh, that's where the church has already been for millennia. So
Hmm.
that's not to sound like arrogantly like throwing our weight around, other than just to say some of the features of the reason that your church is the way that it is because that is a stable and faithful way to build community. And you don't sit in your little smugness of saying, "Hey, we have this figured out." You put in some anchor points and you throw some ropes off the mountain to those who are trying to find it. So I think
Hmm.
we need to have a healthy self-image as a church and have and be thankful for what God has done. If you're part of a congregation that is doing well, see that as a gift from God. It doesn't have to be that way, but then really be thinking clearly of what is it that I'm supposed to do with this wealth that I've been given. How do we steward our blessings well? And I think that the answer to that is probably going to be far more tactile and seemingly practical than it is ethereal or some kind of evasive spiritual something. So yeah, don't be afraid as a church of the hands-on practical engagement with the world around you. There are a lot of not just young people, but a lot of people in general who need a community that can give them a hug and give them a little advice on all categories of their lives. I know I need that. It's part of the reason I go to church. And so uh, live into that and don't see that as a pitfall. If you need that in your life, recognize it's part of what it means to be human and having a need for good spiritual fellowship and for physical fellowship and interaction in your life. So I I don't know, Cameron, is there something wrong with me that I tend to just be an optimist on this kind of thing of looking at the young people out there, seeing that they really do have real needs, and it's a weird time to be a young person, but on the other hand, I'm in their corner. I'm on their side. I think we should bet on them and encourage and cheer for them as a church because God's going to use them to do things, to see problems, to fix problems, to have skills that we can't even dream of yet. And so uh, I wouldn't bet against them.
Absolutely. I'm 100% with you. So, yeah, I think I'm optimistic, and I'll put it this way, Nathan. I'm not worried overall about God's church. because it's in his hands. Doesn't mean there aren't problems. Doesn't mean we don't face challenges. Every generation does. Every decade does. This is the way it always goes. But I also believe the gates of hell will not prevail against God's church. So I'm more excited about the young people than I am worried about them. I'll put it that way. And so, yeah, let's all do our part to be there for them. And that part of that just involves hanging out with them, showing them what life looks like. They want that. And that would be a very good thing. So let's all be willing to do that. Let's all be agents of healing in this world. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.